That's a little hot. Good afternoon, everybody. Can those of you in the back, you can see me all right? You can see our guests all right? All right. My name is Ian Bernhoft. Welcome to the Humanities Forum. It's our last forum of the year. You can expect them more or less every Friday during the semester in the spring as well. The forum is an initiative of the Humanities program. It offers the Providence College community the opportunity to learn from leading scholars, professionals, journalists from around the country and indeed around the world. Here you can engage in intellectual life outside the classroom, even though, yes, I know you're literally inside a classroom right now. You can explore diverse perspectives and you can deepen your appreciation for the humanities. So today's forum is going to be structured as a conversation. The rules, I have the microphone, you don't, so I'll be talking for a while with our guests. But after about 45 minutes, we're going to open it up for Q&A to the audience. The immutable Humanities Forum rule is that a student has to ask the first question, then after that it's open season. The other things you should know is you should put your screens away. Those ones, the ones in front of you, close them down. You don't need them here, they don't need you. There you go. You'll be able to actually be in the room without them. Yeah. If you need to take notes for a class, you can use your hand. You can also get the recording from me next week. It'll be fine. It'll be fine. The other thing you should know is that when we wrap up around 4:30, 4:40, you should head down the hall. We've got a nice little reception in the great room. You're more than welcome. You're encouraged to attend. Now, our guest today, let me introduce our guest. Ignat Solzhenitsyn carries a monumental name, one of the major names of the 20th century, right? Like Churchill, King, Mandela. Because his father, Alexandr Solzhenitsyn, was one of the towering figures of the 20th century. He was a Russian novelist and dissident whose writings exposed the realities of Soviet totalitarianism to the entire world. He, after World War II, he served in the Russian army during World War II. He was imprisoned in the Gulag for treasonous behavior. The Gulag being the system of concentration camps that spread throughout the Soviet Union, which was a death sentence for most. He spent, 8 years, 10 years there?
8 years.
8 years. 8 years in the Gulag. He lived to tell the tale, and he ended up telling the tale to the whole world. His works like A Day in the Life of Ivan Denisovich and most prominently The Gulag Archipelago sold over 30 million copies worldwide. He won a Nobel Prize for literature and really sort of helped to bring down the Soviet Union. Now, in the 70s, after The Gulag Archipelago was published, Solzhenitsyn and his family, and including Ignat, who was, I think, maybe 2 at the time, had to live in exile in America, which is where our guest today grew up. Now, that's his father. Ignat himself is a very prominent musician. He has served as, he served as translator and editor of much of his father's work, including a collection of speeches that just came out, and there's a forthcoming work as well that he can tell us about today. But he himself is the principal guest conductor of the Moscow Symphony Orchestra and the conductor laureate of the Chamber Orchestra of Philadelphia. He's led orchestras worldwide, including Baltimore, Cincinnati, Dallas, and Mariinsky. But he's also, in addition to being a conductor, he's a very acclaimed pianist. So he's performed concertos. He tours the country, has performed concertos in Boston, Chicago, Philadelphia, Montreal, Seattle, Toronto, London, Paris, Israel City, all over the world. You name a continent, he's probably given a major concert there. He holds, he's an Avery Fisher Career Grant winner, and he's currently a faculty member at the Curtis Institute of Music. He lives in New York with his wife. Most recently, he published We Have Ceased to See the Purpose, Essential Speeches of Alexandr Solzhenitsyn. Please give a warm welcome to Ignat Solzhenitsyn. So, excuse me. So you were born in the Soviet Union very shortly before your family went into exile, and then you grew up in the United States, right, in Vermont. For starters, I'm curious, what was your father particularly eager to impart to you and your 2 brothers when you were growing up?
He was particularly eager to transmit to us my mother's, their personal and collective and a love of Russia, love of country, love of home, and their belief, especially my father's belief. My mother wavered in those years for understandable reasons. If those of you who know that, some of you even remember that history, but he always believed he would go back physically, as indeed proved to be the case about 20 years later. So that was, I think, the main thing that was consciously imparted to us.
So when you were a boy, did you have a strong sense of my home is elsewhere?
My homeland is elsewhere. I think human beings are so adaptable, and children especially, in all kinds of circumstances, including very fortunate and very unfortunate and tragic. And every circumstance we can adapt to quickly, especially kids. And so I think for us, for my brothers and for me, certainly we felt very secure and comfortable in our new home. It felt like home. I mean, especially the house itself. Just, it's just like anybody else. That you have the place that you have the kitchen and you have the bedroom, and those are places that you become very comfortable with. But in a broader sense, of course, home was elsewhere, and that was not for any lack of appreciation or indeed gratitude for the generosity of this country, famously known to welcome immigrants, to welcome people, exiles in our case, but people from other shores, and to give refuge. And so they felt that, my parents, and I've always felt that my whole life, that I'm a stranger who was welcomed here and made to feel at home. Despite that, home has also been somewhere else in that less tangible, cultural, spiritual way.
What's a formative memory you have of your father when you were growing up? This could be sort of a recurrent, habit or conversation topic, or just like a single instance where stands out in your memory.
Well, that's hard to say, honestly, because it's a more complete picture maybe in my mind's eye as I think back to my childhood years and growing up with in his house and my mother's house. A series of continuing events or images that blend into one, or a composite image, as I think it's called in photography. But one is dinner table conversation. Actually, exactly what sociologists say is vanishing from today's world. And you younger generation are much better placed to tell us if that's so or not, if what it's like at your home and in your family, and do people still have dinner together? And if they do, are they on their phones, or are they talking about something? And certainly back in those days, and certainly in our family, dinner time was the one time of day everybody was together, and it was a series of, to me as a child, endlessly fascinating conversations. My father wasn't present at every meal because sometimes he would be too busy and didn't want to interrupt his work. So he would have dinner with us several times a week, but not 7 days a week. But so on those ones when he was present, he tended to fill us in on what he had heard. This will sound very old-fashioned to the kids here, if I may call you that. But on the radio is how he got his news. Not only before the internet, but really before a lot of people had TV. We didn't have TV. Radio is what he was used to, coming from the Soviet Union. And he got his news that way for many years. And so he would tell us, BBC Russian service, from the Radio Liberty Russian service. For him, it was easier, of course, to get them in Russian. And he would share important news, hopeful news, more often dispiriting news that he would have heard earlier that day or in the preceding couple days. And this was a time, I suppose every time in history is important, but some feel more consequential than others. And this was a time when, as you well know, communism was on the march, was aggressively, that domino effect you've read about in your history textbooks, I hope. But that idea that one nation falls and another nation falls, and that it's not happening by accident. And so, in no particular order, but Afghanistan and Poland, Solidarność, martial law, of course, the attempted assassination of John Paul II, the rise of Mrs. Thatcher in the UK, the election of Ronald Reagan, I think seen even more as a seminal event now, even than then. But then one could tell something's really changed in this country, and in great measure as a response to world events and as a response to the Soviet threat. I think a big reason for Reagan's triumph in 1980. So and any number of other news that I tended to learn first from my father. So his news came from the radio, and my news came up to a certain age from him before I read the newspaper, and so forth.
And presumably, as he's telling you the news, he was also shaping your understanding of it and the sort of moral lens through which you encountered the world.
Of course, and that was the key feature of it.
Now, retrospectively, right? We're talking about like the late 70s, early 80s. Now, retrospectively, we look back. We know these are like the waning days of the Soviet Union. Did it feel that way at the time?
No.
Because you were saying it was like very worried about the domino effect.
Although I think in a certain way it did to him. And, my father is, some of you may know this, has been repeatedly described as a prophet. That's a word that we're uncomfortable with. I mean, I'm kind of uncomfortable with it. Certainly he didn't describe himself that way. But I mean, we're uncomfortable with it because it's so at odds with modernity. And prophets are from a different time. Prophets are from the Old Testament and so forth. But there's a reason, it seems to me, that this has occurred time and time again from all kinds of different writers and thinkers and journalists and even just onlookers, just regular folks. And he had this uncanny ability to see into the future in a way that I think most of us cannot, or don't bother trying. And that's one of the things that he saw, was that this regime that he had fought tooth and nail was so corrupted, also corrupt, but corrupted at its core, was so hollow that it could not stand much longer.
To what extent was he also interested in looking towards the past as well? And by which I mean, did he talk to you much, you and your brothers, about his experiences in World War II, about his experiences in the Gulag, about his experiences living under Soviet repression? Or was he, a lot of parents like to tell stories, and as they get older, they tend to tell the same stories over and over again. And I'm sure your father had stories that put the whole, I walked uphill to school both ways in the snow to shame, right? So was he interested in really bringing you into the history of his life and his experiences?
Well, the short answer is no, but not in the way that you might think. Sometimes I've been asked that question or a version of that question, and I can see by the reaction when I've answered in various ways in the past, I can see people like, oh, I get it. That's too, what would we say now, too traumatic. Those experiences are too traumatic, and he wouldn't have wanted maybe to talk about it. And of course,
I think triggering is the latest lingo.
Triggering, even more so, even more au courant, thank you. But that wasn't it at all, as far as I can tell. Those experiences were extremely intense and extremely serious and tragic in many cases. Because we are talking about fighting in World War II, and we're talking about his arrest, talking about 8 years in the camps, and we're talking about an essential death sentence from cancer that should have, he was supposed to die in a matter of weeks, and he didn't, and all those things that happened, and many others. So it wasn't for lack of, oh, it's something I don't want to talk, just the opposite. He, of course, dedicated his life not to telling his story, but to telling the broader story of what had happened to his country. So the reason he wasn't, I say, necessarily interested in sharing it or telling us about it was he wanted us to read about it. And I think as any writer worth his salt, he didn't want to, you see this on, book, not so much in C-SPAN book TV, if you have ever seen that, is more involved and more serious. But if you see maybe a morning show on television, and someone has a new book out, or even on the evening news shows, on CNN or Fox News, and somebody has a new book out, and they said, okay, let's have him as a guest. And they said, okay, well, you've written this book, tell me what it's about. And if that guy or gal is any good, they'll give you that 20-second summary. Well, it's this, this, and this. And then I always wonder, why should I bother reading it, right? And I mean, but he, of course, had that more old-fashioned view of, I put everything I know, everything I suffered, everything I believe into this, or into one book, into another book, even into an article. So read that, think about it, then come talk to me. Then ask me your questions, then disagree with me or agree with me. But so it was all in there, in the panoply of his writings.
Did you find that daunting, though, as a young boy? Just, if he says, all right, you read this, and you're like, well, Pops, that's 1,800 pages there. I don't know if...
I don't remember feeling that. I have to say I loved to read. I still love to read. I suppose that's not surprising, coming from in the family in which I was reared. But I love to read anything and everything, and all kinds of serious literature, and less, and kind of, young person's literature, and all kinds of everything. And my parents curated, you might say, quite thoughtfully, the order in which we might wish to read his works. So that, as it happens, I read the Gulag Archipelago at a very young age, but I didn't start with it. And I suppose that if I had started with it, that might have been obviously daunting or just too much to understand. But we started with I can tell you exactly what we started with was actually my father himself read out loud to us from one of his very greatest works, also one of his shortest works, Matryona's Home. It's a 30-page short story. And he read to us by the fireplace, if you want a touch of color. And that was, I'm sure, just one evening, because it's 30 pages. So, it's probably an hour and a half to read out loud. But he would read other things. But that was the first. So that's a moment that I can recall, a specific moment, because that was my first meeting with his work.
Now, a number of the students here read his Harvard address this past week. And, in that speech, he's very critical of America and of the West. And I think it caught probably his audience at Harvard off guard, because they thought, oh, you're going to come and you're going to tell us how evil communism is and how blessed America is and how good it is here and how good liberal democracy is. And he didn't really do that. Now, for those in the room who haven't read it, could you, I could try, but better you, give the sort of critique of his, or the nutshell of his critique of America in that address, but also in his thinking, like, what did he see in the West and in the United States that he was troubled by and that he was trying to call attention to?
Okay. In a nutshell, as you said, in a nutshell, I'll read you one sentence. If as claimed by humanism, man were born only to be happy, he would not also be born to die. He would not also be born to die. So his critique of the West, and I'd like to also take just partial issue with that, and I'll explain in a moment, but essentially is a call for the West. First of all, it's always hopeful. It's always, he believed more, as much as any thinker or writer has ever believed, it seems to me, in the power and decisiveness or decisive role of human agency. And so nothing is ever written, nothing is ever decided, nothing's ever too late. It's never too late to do the right thing. It's never too late to repent. It's never too late to take charge. It's never too late to fill in the blank. And so he felt that the West was little by little, America in particular, but the West in general, losing touch with precisely those eternal values that had made it great, that had made the West unquestionably, in one area of human endeavor after another, the leader, as we would say now. You know, who leads the world in X, Y, or Z? The West, in so many areas for so long. But those leadership positions stemmed not, first and foremost, he thought, from technological superiority, not necessarily, or first and foremost, from specific scientific improvements, or the discovery of penicillin, or Benjamin Franklin, or you name it. But in a broad sense, from values that stemmed, first of all, from that creator referenced even by the deistic, somewhat dubiously Christian, in other words, not necessarily Christian founders of this country, right? Not specifically Christian, but who had that sense of a creator above us, a something above us that provides the basis for those inalienable rights and so on and so forth. So that's one thing. And secondly, just want to read to you the little introduction. Technically, it's not part of his speech, and I don't know what edition. I don't know if you use this or if you use something else or just from the internet. Those of you who were just studying it may not have read this because it's it's printed in italics here in this new collection, and it's not part of the speech. It's a little preamble. It's almost, if I give you a prepared speech and I stand up and say, ladies and gentlemen, good afternoon, I'm happy to be here. I'm happy to see you, but that's not officially part of the text. It's just a little comment to smooth the rails. I don't think that's the right expression, but you know what I mean. And so he says here something along those lines, except it's incredibly important. I'm pleased at the opportunity to greet the 327th graduating class of this old and illustrious Harvard University, and I heartily salute all the graduates. The motto of your university is Veritas. Some of you already know, and others will find out in the course of their lives. The truth slips away from us the moment we take our eye off it, all the while leaving the illusion that we continue to follow in its path. This kindles much discord. Also, truth is seldom sweet, but invariably bitter. A measure of that bitter taste is unavoidable in today's speech, too. Yet I offer it as no adversary, but as a friend. So I think it's just a long answer to your question, but that's very important to keep in mind when we read that speech, that it's not, speaking of bitterness, it's not embittered towards the West at all. At least I don't read it that way at all. It's very frank. It is a powerful critique, but it's a critique given as a friend. It's a critique as your spouse or your parent or your coach or your teacher or your friend. I mean, really, as one person can give to another and say, listen, let me tell you what I'm seeing. This is what I see, and you can be better. You can do better.
So he's not a judge looking to condemn. He's a doctor looking to diagnose.
I think so. I think so.
Was this did the themes touched on here in terms of in the West, right? He sees a surplus of materialism, a sort of like legalistic attachment to rights rather than any sort of embrace of human responsibility. Were these sort of big preoccupations of his during the time that he spent in the United States, or were his eyes more set on the fall of communism and on looking east, if that makes sense?
Well, that's a great question, Ian. He was preoccupied, of course, with the fate of his country when he lived there, which was the majority, well, no, the entirety of his life up until then. His perception of the West, which he describes in many places, I almost wonder if there's just a quick one to read to you here from his London speech. But in short, I won't look for it now, but he, especially for any freedom-loving person enslaved in the Soviet Union, particularly those enslaved in a real sense, at the bottom of society, his fellow zeks, the prisoners in the Gulag like himself, and others in much even worse circumstances. For them, collectively, the West was a beacon of light. The West was a great source of hope, a source of. He never went that far, but some of his fellow Zeks did a source of deliverance. Although MacArthur will keep pushing, and or some new army will come, and from the United States or from, and they'll liberate us. But in general, though, more broadly, the idea that West is the place where freedom is cherished and nourished and valued, where the great eternal values of are respected and sustained. Well, so when he did find himself in the West, first in Switzerland, I should say, for a couple of years, because he was put in a plane and he was arrested in our apartment in Moscow. He was taken away. He didn't know where, for how long, or what would happen, but he went through the usual process of which he knew very well, exactly what would happen, how the prisoner is processed, the incoming prisoner, and the strip search and the quick medical test and the paperwork and all of that stuff stuffed into a cell in the Lefortovo prison, and then eventually taken to for a kind of interrogation. And it all happened at warp speed, and he didn't know if he would be executed or if he would be sent away to the camps again. He ended up being accused formally of treason to the Soviet Union for publishing the Gulag Archipelago, and expelled. But where, he didn't know. So some of you have read, others will read perhaps The Oak and the Calf, his memoirs of those years, and it's described in the most riveting kind of minute by minute, those 24 hours, riveting fashion, how he's put in a plane and he doesn't know where it's going. And he figures out by the direction of the sun that it is going west, not east.
It's a relief.
And then, but what country and what? So all of that. So we suddenly ended up the plane landed in Frankfurt, in Germany. We lived in Switzerland. Family was allowed to join a few weeks later, and then in America. But finding himself, Harvard is 4 years into that exile, which would last a total of 20 years between Switzerland and the US combined. And so at a certain point, actually immediately he understood this isn't going to be for a week or for a month. I mean, obviously, even he didn't think things would change that quickly. He just believed someday it will happen. But so 3 or 4 years now into his stay in the West, which may well last decades more, and it did, he, of course, as I think is natural for a thinking person, for an open person, to want to learn more about where am I and who are the people I'm around, who are around me, and I'm with them, and what is this country like, and so in the broad sense, in the philosophical and political sphere, big picture, what he saw was a West that was not living up to those standards that it had set for itself, and to those was not really still standing on that pedestal on which he and his friends had perhaps falsely, perhaps naively placed it.
So in some respects, there was a lot of disappointment or sort of disillusion.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. But in that sense, that you are better than you're showing today. And also, he had been trained to believe that the whole point about the Western system was pluralism. The whole point was tolerance. The whole point was a free exchange of ideas. And so he honestly thought that a spirited discussion would be welcome. And it ended up being very welcome by the average person in this country. I mean, of those who were paying attention. And it was broadcast on the networks, and it was published in all the newspapers. It was a big deal. 6th of June, 1978. It was a big deal in this country. And he received thousands of letters of support and saying, thank you for saying that. And I think so too. And just some guy from somewhere in Iowa, anywhere.
After the Harvard commencement.
After the Harvard.
Yeah.
But the quote-unquote critical reaction, the official reaction, in other words, the what we call now the mainstream media and the academy, tended to be negative. I'm sure if you tally up what the New York Times said and what the Christian Science Monitor said and whoever else, and then it tended to be, but it tended to be a sort of take it personally. I think if you read those essays or just, it tended to be like, who are you to
come to our country and
you're supposed to be grateful.
Us? Yeah.
And he was grateful, and I think he thought he expressed that, and he certainly felt that. But he was surprised that at what he saw as the thin skin, because it wasn't the criticisms weren't personal, so to speak. They weren't. They were just, well, I've already explained how I read them and how I see them and how I think he saw them.
Now, the most recent collection of his essential speeches that you hold in your hand, you gave it, excuse me, you gave it the title, "We Have Ceased to See the Purpose." Can you tease out where that line comes from and why you chose that to be the title of the book?
We have ceased to see the purpose. So that's the title of the collection. I've given it that title as the editor of it, but the title comes from him, not for the collection, which of course is posthumous, but it is the title of one of the speeches, one of the 10 speeches in here, and that was a speech delivered at the International Academy of Philosophy in Liechtenstein. It so happens, and the title of that speech is "We Have Ceased to See the Purpose." And perhaps I could read to you, if
yes, please do.
That's desirable, a little bit from that speech, and let's see here it is, where that comes into play, so that I think if I read you just a couple of paragraphs, you'll have a better understanding than I could possibly suggest to you in paraphrasing. It's a section called "Progress Misestimated." And he's talking about progress with a capital P as a kind of a
Sort of an ideal that we worship.
Exactly. You took the words out of my mouth. Exactly. A secular God, the God of progress. So he says the first triviality that we overlooked and only recently discovered, unlimited progress cannot occur within the limited resources of our planet. He goes on, he makes a kind of environmental pitch here, and then he says the second miscalculation turned out to be that the human temperament did not soften with progress, as had been promised.
In other words, that people didn't become more gentle and peace-loving and benign.
Wasn't that what the French Revolution was supposed to give us? But the exact opposite occurred immediately, if anything, in its very birth pangs. We've allowed, he continues, we've allowed our wants to grow unchecked and are now at a loss where to direct them. I think this is where it gets very interesting, I think even for the most materialist-minded person. Because you could say, yes, why not? Why shouldn't we want more cars, more goods, more houses, more money, more whatever? It is a free country, it is a free society, and I work hard for my money and all that stuff. And nobody's saying that's not right. But it's not what others will think. It's not how others will judge you. You know, you're a materialist. You know, you should give more to the poor, or you should get a job in a non-for-profit. It's not that. It's how do you feel about yourself? Is this what makes your life, when you look in the mirror, complete? And so he says, we are at a loss where to direct them, our wants. We are at a loss. And with the obliging assistance of commercial enterprises, newer and yet newer wants are conjured and concocted, some wholly artificial. And we chase after them en masse, but find no satiation. And we never shall. The endless accumulation of possessions, that will not sate us either. Skipping ahead, dynamic modern transportation has flung the world wide open to people of the West. But even without it, modern man can all but leap out beyond the confines of his being. This is just before the internet. But even so, he's saying you can, through the eyes of television, he is present throughout the whole planet all at the same time. Yet it turns out that from this spasmodic pace of technocentric progress, from the oceans of superficial information and trashy spectacles, the human soul grows not deeper but more shallow, and spiritual life is diminished. Our culture, accordingly, grows poorer and dimmer, no matter how it tries to drown out its decline with the din of empty novelties. So just skipping forward to finish this section. No, all hope cannot be pinned on science, technology, or economic growth. So by the way, that means some hope can be pinned on those things, of course. Those are good things. But not all hope. Victorious technological civilization has simultaneously instilled in us a spiritual insecurity. A spiritual insecurity. Certainly its gifts enrich, but enslave us as well. All is interests. We must not neglect our interests. All is a struggle for material things. But an inner voice faintly prompts us that we've lost something pure, elevated, and fragile. We have ceased to see the purpose. Let us admit, even if in a whisper, and only to ourselves. I love that. You don't have to make a public statement about it or even tell your friends. But in a whisper and only to ourselves, in this bustle of life at breakneck speed, what are we living for?
You mentioned how your father's often has a prophetic voice. And listening to that, it occurs to me that if you zoom forward 20 years after that and you showed him one of those bar graphs of rates of Instagram use and rates of suicidal ideation and depression and anxiety just going up, he would say, yeah, that's the continuation of the direction that I just diagnosed.
Sure.
I want to ask you a little bit about your own career and then bring that back to the Solzhenitsyn legacy if I could. So obviously, everybody heard in the introduction, you've had a very successful career as a musician. How did that happen for you? How did you get into music? What was your path? And ultimately, what connections do you see between your work in music and your father's work in literature?
Well, I think I specialize in only one form of art, and that's more than enough to challenge me for my entire life. But having spent my life in it, I think I have a sense of, at least a vague sense of all the arts, and it seems to me that in all the important ways, the arts are the same. They arise from the same source within us, or perhaps outside of us, and they offer the same avenue for the expression of what is most important within us, and particularly of things that cannot otherwise find expression except through art. So yes, so as a musician, I feel a great affinity, a brotherhood with the other arts, certainly with the written word, as a pursuit that is there for exactly the same reason, for the same purpose, and hoping to, in short, that affirms the best that is in us as a species. So,
presumably, your parents encouraged this from a young age, right? You had to pursue piano seriously, and
well, yes and no. Yes and no for this reason, that first of all, there was no plan or determination that children must have music lessons or piano lessons or whatever the case may be, as many parents do, which is, of course, I can only welcome that and appreciate that, and that's great. And there's so many things worth studying, but I think, as Plato says, nothing is more worthwhile than music. Certainly I say that. But my parents didn't have that particular thought, especially in those circumstances of being thrown across the ocean and finding themselves in a really chaotic and complicated personal environment. And they had seen a kind of a flip side of the coin. Those who think that children don't really know for themselves what they want or what they should want, and parents can and should decide for them. Well, there's a lot of truth in that, but there's the flip side of the coin, which is that in the Soviet Union, especially, where music education was super serious, but it was like it or not, you're going to practice 3 hours a day, and you're going to really learn the violin or the cello or the piano really well. And for somebody who didn't particularly like practicing, nobody actually really likes practicing, but a lot of us will tolerate it because we love music. But not everybody loves music, at least not to the extent that to really study it seriously, and when your friends are playing soccer or whatever. So they had seen, my parents had seen, a lot of sort of family drama where kids are being forced, and as my father is an artist, obviously himself, kind of thinking, does that make sense? To force a child into art? Okay, mathematics you need for your survival. You need to, right? You can't do the multiplication table, you won't survive in this world. But certainly you don't need to play the piano to survive. That's not a very advantageous way to make a living. So if anything, they had a certain bias against forcing anybody. But my great fortune was that, apart from that overall milieu in which I was growing up in our family, in other words, a great appreciation for the arts. By the way, my parents loved music. They loved listening to music. My mother had a small but very wonderful record collection. You guys know what those are because they're coming back into vogue, LPs, right? The big ones. But there was a piano in the house, that old farmhouse that they had purchased in New England, in Vermont. Well, we are in New England, so I have to specify. In Vermont, it came with furniture left over from the previous owner, and one of them was a little baby grand. And I was drawn to it, and I wanted to. I had already shown, in retrospect, as they realized, this signs of a real talent for music, but they hadn't put two and two together at first. But that was the proximate cause was that piano.
I should let other people besides me have a shot at the microphone. So at this point, I'll bring the microphone to you, and you should just say your name, say your question, and we'll continue the conversation with more questioners. Who'd like to grab one? The first one.
2025, I was going to say Medal of Courage will go to whoever is willing to ask the first question, but so you get it, sir.
Yeah, first off, my name's Finn. I'd just like to say thank you. That was a really good talk. I know you said earlier that you really like to read, and that like reading's obviously been a big part of your life. What's like been the most important book you've read, and like how has that impacted your life?
The most important book, boy, do I have to name one? Okay, I guess it's lame if I don't. So fine, I'll name one. I'm not going to say the Bible because that's too easy. But I guess that's the correct answer. So I'll say the Divine Comedy. Divine Comedy, everybody knows him, of course, Dante. But that's a book a poem, a book, a novel, a world that really, really makes me proud to be a human. When I think that I'm in some small, tiny way related, that I have what is it, DNA? I don't have any science. But do I share DNA or whatever it is that I share the human genes, the genome with that man, Dante Alighieri. That's incredibly heartening. Just to think of what we can accomplish. So I guess that would be the one.
Well, over to you. Just wait for a sec.
Okay. Hi, my name's Noelle. I really appreciated you sharing about your father's life and his philosophies. You shared how he was like deeply patriotic and he still cherished his Russian homeland. I'm curious, what would you think your father's position would be on the Russian invasion of Ukraine and its continuation as of right now?
Russia, Ukraine, yeah, that's very complicated. It's very complicated. The war is complicated, the situation is complicated, and it's complicated because, ultimately, those, the underlying questions are complicated. In other words, what is Russia? What is Ukraine? National identity, linguistic identity, cultural identity, and it's so very much intermixed and interrelated, including in millions of families, including in our family. My father was a quarter Ukrainian himself, so what does that make me, an eighth Ukrainian? He spoke only Ukrainian with one of his grandfathers. And this is typical. And of course, millions of Ukrainians don't speak Ukrainian, they only speak Russian. And that's changing, but that's still, I think, the case, certainly. Now, so it's all very complicated, and I wouldn't presume to judge exactly what he would say today, except to say that the spectacle of Russians and Ukrainians killing each other would be utter anathema to him and would pain him profoundly.
To piggyback on that question really quickly, is there, what would you say is like a Western or an American understanding of Russia today that you think is fundamentally off, or you would want to correct? Or
You know, back in 1980, which again must seem frightfully long time ago to many of you, but and even to probably to all of us, it's starting to feel like that's you know, that more than the day before yesterday. But in some ways, it does feel like yesterday. My father wrote an article, a whole article about Western misconceptions of Russia. This, of course, was at the height of, height is the right word, but just about at the height of Soviet expansionism and Soviet aggression. Articles in Foreign Affairs, if you want to look it up, you know, very prestigious journal of, actually, of these, as we would say now, the establishment. The world has changed since then, and yet it hasn't. And I think the best way I could answer your question would be to suggest that in the most important ways, Russia has changed. Russia has changed dramatically.
From the Soviet days?
From the Soviet days. From the existential threat to Western, not only Western values, but Western existence, the actual existence, physical existence of the West, that it exemplified and attempted to achieve. Russia is a very, very different place today. So in terms of its the actual threat that it may pose to the outside world and to the West in particular, and certainly internally, in terms of what life is like in Russia and what, in terms of the level of prosperity, which is, of course, incomparable. I mean, it's nowhere near, it's incomparable to what America is today, of course. And yet, it's also incomparably higher than it was in the Soviet times. And then incomparable in terms of freedom. It's not what it should be. It's not what it could be. It's not what it will be. But it's a categorically different place than it was under communism. In a word, because communism, totalitarianism of any kind, which really is communism and fascism, particularly National Socialism, sought to dominate every aspect, every facet of the human person, of the human being. And that's not the case in Russia today, far from it. So, and yet, Russia has changed, but the Western approach to Russia, I would say, has changed very little, has changed not enough. And when I say the Western, obviously, any number of you may disagree or say, well, what about just speaking stereotypically speaking in a very large summation of, if we could summarize how the West views Russia, I'd say pretty much the same as it always did, or as it did in the Soviet years. And even Ronald Reagan, who should have known better, and Reagan is a hero to, well, he's a hero to many people in this country. He's certainly a hero to everybody in Eastern Europe, and Central Europe and Eastern Europe, and in Cuba and in China, and anybody who was, but particularly in Europe, in Russia and Europe, people who were dominated by communism, and here came an American president and said, stop, and we're not going to put up with this. So, but even Reagan confused Russian and Soviet, whether as a rhetorical flourish or because he hadn't thought deeply enough about it. But what was mildly annoying to us as Russians then, well, okay, he doesn't know exactly, or he's just saying it, but maybe he's saying it so that the average Joe in America doesn't get confused or doesn't really want to be thinking about geopolitics, so he says Ruski or he says Russian, but okay. But it turns out that was symptomatic of what was to come which is, yeah, as I understand it, as I read it from the right and from the left in this country, again, broadly speaking, nothing's changed. It's still the big bad Russian bear, and it's still a Cold War, or it's a new Cold War. And I certainly understand. I certainly understand a lot of the reasons that have caused that point of view. But nonetheless, I find it in the big picture and in the long term quite misguided and quite short-sighted.
Hello, my name is Benedict, and thanks for the discussion. And your father seems to have had a very like keen sense of seeing like culture versus like you made the distinction Russian versus Soviet or totalitarianism, and it's very interesting how in the gulags you said that there were a lot of people who saw America as something, like they see this Western idea, and I was just wondering, like, do you have any insight of like how your father, when he came to America, he just almost knew instantly that it wasn't what he had heard it should be. So it's like the conception of America as it should be, he comes and it's not what it should be. Even though he's not American, he still somehow knows what it is to be Western and to be American. I'm just wondering if you had any insight on that, like his views.
I think he would be the first to acknowledge that his perceptions may well have been incomplete, may well have been somehow one-sided, not consciously, but just, in other words, that he wasn't, what would you say, as a sociologist who had been studying this society for many years and really could speak with authority on the, no. My sense is that his complex of perceptions, I'll come back to that, about the West and the general situation of the West in the world at that moment, at that particular historical moment, was guided first and foremost by, well, since the West is a collection of democracies, an amalgam of democracies, and each individual country is a democracy, the ones that matter or the ones that lead on the world stage, whether it's the same ones who have been around for a few centuries, the US and the UK and France, and West Germany then, and Japan, that he liked that idea of Japan as the far West. Far East, obviously, but far West also, in that battle to the death between the East and the West, ideological battle, as it then was. But that's another thing that's different now. There's no it's not an ideological difference today. It's, anyway, but that really was. And so what he saw in the behavior of the leaders of these democracies, which, like it or not, but they do tend to, and I think that's true of Trump, that's true of Biden, that's true of Obama, that's true of Mrs. Thatcher, it's true of Ted Heath, who was not a very impressive prime minister in the 70s in the UK, and any number of French presidents, anybody, it doesn't really matter, but generally speaking, they are representing their people. In a broad sense, I'm sure not everyone in this room supports Trump, and not everyone in this room supports Biden, and whatever. So at any given moment, half the country's against. But I guess it's important, it's not half, it's less than half, or it's more than half that coalesced around X, Y, or Z. And that's the person who is speaking and acting for the country, and if that doesn't suit the people, he gets booted out. And that does happen over and over and over. And for all the crying about the state of democracy in America, how many times has the White House changed hands? Just in your lifetimes, again, thinking of the younger people in this room. Already 3 or 4 times it's changed from one party to the other and then back. So that's a long way of saying that to the extent that what leaders say and do does represent the values and the desires of their people, to the extent that it does, the actions of Western democracies, particularly at that time in the mid-70s, he found to be greatly lacking in conviction. He found them to be lacking in courage. He found them to be lacking in will, just a will to succeed and a will to say no, to stand, a will to stand and fight. And so those were, I guess, the main components of his skeptical view of the West's, of the totality of the West's sense of purpose.
Professor Mahoney, you get the last question.
Ignat, I thought I would ask you just to explicate a little bit of what you had said about the Creator and some of the spiritual themes, the affirmation of the soul, in We Have Ceased to See the Purpose and the Harvard Address. And I have this in mind. I noticed that both Solzhenitsyn's admirers and almost all of his critics assume that everything Solzhenitsyn had to say on these matters was a product of sort of imposing the grid of Russian orthodoxy on his view of the West or the view of his the future of his own country. And yet, as you point out in your introduction to We Have Ceased the Purpose there, your father's, the way he spoke about religious and spiritual matters is very discreet. It's not sectarian. It's not specifically orthodox. It's, you might say, more theistic than anything else. And there's a kind of, there's the same man who said when he was asked in a BBC Russian service interview what he thought of the new pope, words fail me, it's a gift from God. You can't picture Dostoevsky getting excited about a Polish pope. By the way, Solzhenitsyn met John Paul II, the only meeting John Paul II had on October 15th, 1993, the 15th anniversary of his beginning of his pontificate, was with Solzhenitsyn in Rome. So one would like to have been a fly on the wall, as they say. But anyway, I think it's important to clarify that because it seems to me there's a very rich reflection in these speeches, especially the Western speeches of your father, and maybe going back to the Nobel lecture, that managed just to evoke the transcendentals, the true, the good, and the beautiful, the drama of good and evil in the human soul, the way in which a kind of debased modernity ignores the needs of the soul, but does so with a certain sensitivity to the requirements of modernity or the modern reader or listener. And anyway, I'll let you consider those points.
I appreciate that question very much. Professor Dan Mahoney, by the way, one of the absolute top authorities on Solzhenitsyn in the world, and certainly in this country, Daniel J. Mahoney, Professor Emeritus. I hope I'm saying that right.
That is correct.
Assumption College, not so far from here.
But I'm not retired.
Right, not retired. And I think somebody who's spoken in this
I have.
here on campus, not in the recently. So thank you very much.
In this very room.
In this very room. So I'm honored that you're here and you've joined our discussion today. And as far as your observation, I think that's very accurate. And I think yes, it speaks to two important aspects of my father's engagement with the spiritual side of life and the spiritual side of thought. One was that a certain modesty that he felt himself and felt people should feel, ought to feel, at least he did, in speaking about religious matters as a layperson. In other words, yes, a pope, a patriarch, a religious leader, that's his job, if you will, right? His job is to preach. His job is to convert. His job is to speak the truth from the pulpit. In fact, he's failing if he's not doing that in some way or other. But for a private person, for a lay person, no matter how deep his belief may be, it's inappropriate to sort of stand up, at least that's how he saw it, and speak too explicitly about something that others may see differently. Others may even be offended, and so forth. And so just a natural, I think, a sense of tact if you will, just good manners, prevented him from being too out front with something that was very important to him personally. And then the other reason related is that Michael Jordan famously said that Republicans buy sneakers too. And he was asked to stand up for some very leftist cause. I don't remember what it was, or at least, but it was something very partisan and very, like, why won't you do it? You're Michael Jordan. He's like, Republicans buy sneakers too. I have a wider audience. Now, that may be seen as a crass comment in a commercial sense because he only cares about money, and you can read it that way. But I've always thought that was a rather witty and actually somewhat noble thing to say on Jordan's part, in the sense, don't cast aspersions on half of your audience. Don't condemn half of your audience and say, well, the half of you that are Democrats or the half of you that are Republicans, you're wicked. And I'm only going to speak to the other half. And so in this, now rising to the broader sense in which Solzhenitsyn didn't want to speak to just Orthodox, his fellow Orthodox Christians, nor to only Christians, more broadly, Western Christians, Eastern Catholics. He wanted to speak to his fellow human beings, everybody. Everybody who felt or potentially could feel that, and then I'll just add this for myself, not for my father, that man lives not by bread alone. So I've just, of course, brought it back to the, I guess you could say explicitly Christian perspective. But I've always thought that man lives not by bread alone is so universal. And it's in that sense that whether you're Christian, whether you're Jewish, whether you're religious at all, but if you have any sense in which that you stand on 2 feet and not, on 4 legs as a beast does in that traditional sense, we're not animals, we're human. You guys study this in your philosophy and in your here at in all your great classes at Providence College. What does that mean? What differentiates us? And in a word, that might be it. That we have a life of the mind, we have a life of the spirit, we have sparks of the spirit, to use Solzhenitsyn's expression, that cannot be satisfied only by the matter present, or even particularly visibly present in our world. And so that's, I think, that what Solzhenitsyn hopes to, that is the chord he hopes to touch in every one of our hearts.
Please join me in warmly applauding our guest, Ignat Solzhenitsyn.